Welcome to another episode of R&R Living Life. Hi, my name is Rosemary. The following is a compilation of photographs taken of the amazing scenery, places Rick and I have visited, and as a reminder of our travels. We began this episode leaving Streaky Bay and continue along the western edge of the Eyre Peninsula towards Smoky Bay. On arriving in Smoky Bay, the first thing that intrigued me was the stacks of oyster racks stored in sheds beside the road before we stopped at the jetty for our usual stroll along its length. The morning was quite cool with a strong breeze, and the jetty had no handrails along most of its length, so I forego my usual walk and strolled along the foreshore and left Rick to walk the length. The jetty was completed in 1912 with the original length of 381 metres. The jetty was commercially used until the 1950s, when advances in road transport made it easier to take grain to the Therenvad silos near Ceduna. In 1968, 88 metres was removed due to government policy, with the whole jetty intended for removal, but due to protests by locals, it was prevented from being dismantled. On leaving the jetty, we stopped at the cast iron whale pot that was manufactured in the 1800s and was originally one of three used at the whaling station or fishery near present-day Port Collision. The cast iron pot was used to render or boil the whale blubber to extract precious oils. The oil was used in lamps to light the streets and homes in Europe and America. We continued along the Flinders Highway, joining the Eyre Highway just before Ceduna, the only township of significance on the eastern side of the Great Australian Bight, located 1,208 kilometres to the east of Norseman in Western Australia, and is very much the last easterly stop before entering the Nullarbor Plain and the vast flat plains which lie to the north of the Great Australian Bight. Ceduna is an attractive town which, with the nearby port of Therenvad, is located on Murat Bay, which in turn is part of the larger Denial Bay. It is a service centre for a rural area known for its agriculture, predominantly grain and sheep, salt and gypsum mining, and seafood, particularly oysters, and is set amidst a patchwork of grain farms, natural bush and rugged rocky bays, secluded white sandy beaches and wilderness. Our visit to Pinky Point, officially known as Cape Therenvad, gave us incredible views of the salt piles being loaded onto cargo ships for transport to Sydney, and a memorial to those lost at sea. Information around the importance of the Therenvad jetty and also included information related to the vessel, the Alenka K, that broke its back and buckled approximately 90 minutes after leaving port, with 7,776 tonnes of wheat on board. From Pinky's Point, we returned to Ceduna to take a stroll along its 380-metre jetty, where I got to see my first live blue swimmer crab. We left Ceduna just after lunch and then stopped at a free camp not far west of the town. We were glad to leave our first overnight free camp on the Nullarbor, as the March flies were extremely friendly. As we drove up to Penong, the windmills that it is famous for stood out against the horizon. This unique collection of around 20 donated and restored windmills, collected from as far away as Marla, the Riverland and Alice Springs, are a tribute to the farmer's whirling workhorse that has nowadays been mostly replaced by solar panels that pump water from underground. The town of Penong and the surrounding district is so dry that the underground water is supplemented by rainwater and water which is carted by truck from a reticulated water supply connected to the Todd River pipeline, some 15 kilometres east of Penong. Leaving Gidget in Penong, we ventured about 15 kilometres south to visit Lake MacDonald, or the Pink Lake. As we drove closer to the lake, we passed the largest deposit of gypsum in Australia, with estimated reserves in excess of 500 million tonnes. Gypsum, which is used both as a fertiliser and in the building trade, has been laid down to a depth of 4.8 metres and covers an area of 87 square kilometres and has been mined since 1919. Further along was the Pink Lake, while on the other side of the causeway, Green Lake, and further down over a small bridge is Blue Lake, that we did not go as far as it was closer to Point Sinclair and Cactus Beach. Wedged between and around the lakes are vast sets of white windswept sand dunes, while the whole area is designated a coastal protection reserve, with all vegetation and wildlife species, including snakes, protected. The Pink Lake is caused by salt-loving algae and bacteria that secrete carotenoid red pigments that turns the water bright pink. On clear days with high salt concentrations and depending on water levels in the lake, the vibrancy of the colour gives the lake the impression of being salmon pink. But we were not so lucky, only seeing tinges of pink. After taking many photographs, we drove back into Penang to refuel and reconnect Gidget before continuing on our journey. The vast semi-arid Nullarbor plain is approximately 270,000 square kilometres and is said to be about 4 times the size of Belgium. The plain is the world's largest slab of exposed limestone rock, with over 250 limestone caves that provide habitat for unusual fauna. Nullarbor means no trees in Latin. Though mostly treeless, in reality the Nullarbor is covered with blue bush and mulga scrub, and even wildflowers after rain. Though there is no known permanent surface water, but large circular depressions called dolines and rock holes that hold water during wet periods. We had yet to see the wildflowers, but we did see the results of the rain that had cut the Nullarbor earlier in our travels. We did a quick stop at Nundaroo Roadhouse, about 80 kilometres from Penang, to check the plugs before continuing on our journey. About 50 kilometres further along the highway, we passed through Yalata, a small roadhouse beside the highway. We continued further west for approximately 80 kilometres to the head of the Bight Observatory, where the spectacular Bunda Cliffs, the longest line of sea cliffs in the world, stretches roughly 200 kilometres along the Great Australian Bight, from just east of where we were to near Border Village on the border with Western Australia. The cliffs are made up of fossil-heavy limestone called Wilson limestone, which was once part of an ancient seabed and was formed about 200 million years ago, when a deep rift occurred in the Earth's crust and admitted the ocean, and finally, approximately 65 million years ago, Australia separated from Antarctica and began drifting northwards. Much of southern Australia was underwater for long periods. During these inundations, sedimentary rocks, mainly limestone, was deposited up to 260 kilometres north of the present coast. The continental shelf formed from the rift with Antarctica extends 200 kilometres south of the coast. A series of uplifts and rising sea levels formed the Bunda Cliffs. Once well inland, they faced the full fury of the Southern Ocean, and at times of high sea levels were progressively undercut. The coastline took its basic present shape 2 to 3 million years ago. In places, the cliffs rise almost vertically between 60 to 120 metres above the windswept ocean. Something remarkable to ponder was the fact that as we drove across the Nullarbor, we were in fact driving across the floor of an ancient seabed. The sight of the cliffs was truly hypnotic and awe-inspiring, though a little chilly. We were too early to see any whales, but did enjoy a walk along the boardwalk that gave us expansive views of the Southern Ocean, spectacular scenery, and the Visitor Information Centre was jam-packed with information. Pastoral runs were established on the Nullarbor in the 1860s, but the western third of the continent remained isolated from the eastern colonies. The Port Augusta-Albany telegraph line that followed ancient Aboriginal trade routes was built across the remote plain between 1874 and 1876 to link the east and the west, and in 1915 the Trans-Australian Railway between Port Augusta and Kalgoorlie was opened. After having a late lunch in the car park at the observatory, we continued on to the Nullarbor Roadhouse, where we refuelled and wandered around this very remote, unique location before continuing along the air highway. We found that a lot of the roadside camps along the Nullarbor were closed. I am not sure if it was because of the rain or that the powers that be were trying to restrict the number of places people can drive off the highway. Being such a fragile environment, I would think restricting people's access would be the most possible reason. We did get to stop at the 164K marker campsite, just off the highway, which gave us a peaceful night's sleep. Day 18 began on the cool side and ended being a long day with many time changes, as we were to gain an extra 2 hours as we crossed the border into Western Australia. My body clock was still trying to catch up, as in some places we were sometimes West Australia time and in others South Australian time, or, as was the case in around Border Village and Eucla, Central Western time. Our first side trip today, just as the sun was rising, was at Scenic Lookout No. 1, South Australia, with stunning views of the coastline, though it was very windy and a little cloudy. 20 minutes further along was Scenic Lookout No. 2, part of the Great Australian Marine Park. Both offered spectacular views. The coastline was absolutely breathtaking, with its sheer, rugged cliffs and the pounding clear blue waters of the Southern Ocean. We arrived at Border Village just on 8:30, refuelling before getting in line to pass through the border quarantine stop, where a checkpoint person checked both Gidget and the boat for agricultural products. The Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development's Quarantine West Australia Service operates border checkpoints as a first line of defence against incursions of unwanted pests, weeds and diseases, which would arrive on freight, cargo and other items brought in from interstate and operated on Australian Central Western Time, which was different from both West Australia and South Australian Standard Time. Eucla, approximately 11 kilometres west of the South Australian border, is the only West Australian location on the air highway that has a direct view of the Great Australian Bight due to its elevated position immediately next to the Eucla Pass, where the highway moves out and down into the basin known as Roe Plains that occurs between the Madura and Eucla passes. We drove through Eucla out to the old telegraph station, where the remaining old stone walls were being covered in mountains of white sand dunes. The Eucla telegraph line and manual telegraphic repeater station was established in 1877, with the line being regarded as one of the most important innovations in the 19th century, connecting the overland telegraph from Darwin, London and Europe to Perth. Prior to this, communications between Western Australia and the rest of the nation took months. The history of the telegraph station was extremely interesting. On leaving Eucla, on the northern side of the highway, we followed tall limestone ridges that were once the coastline and formed the Hampton Tablelands east of the Nullarbor Plain. We had planned to stop at Mundrabella Homestead on the Roe Plains, once a source of sandalwood that was exported to the Far East. For those fascinated by the cosmos, Mundrabella is where Australia's largest meteorite was discovered in 1966, when fragments of a celestial event that took place over 1 million years ago was discovered. It is also a railway siding on the Indian Pacific Railway line across the continent. We stopped for fuel in Madura, 117 metres above sea level, before continuing on to the lookout at the top of the plateau. With an early start from our camp at the Air Bird Observatory car park, day 19 saw us make our way to Cockabiddy, with hole 10, the eagle's nest of the Nullarbor Links golf course, and 2 magnificent wedge-tail eagles that had been injured and unable to be returned to the wild. As with many areas of both South Australia and now Western Australia, the area has very little rainwater and no reliable permanent sources of water. Cockabiddy draws its water from a huge underground lake and relies on saline waters and a distillation plant. Ironically, though, Cockabiddy is famous for the fact that it reputedly has the longest cave in the world at 6 kilometres long, but over 90% of the cave is underwater. We stopped at Kaiguna Roadhouse to check the plugs before again stopping at the Kaiguna Blowhole. The roadhouse, established in 1962, is located at the eastern end of the 146.6 kilometre straight stretch of the Air Highway, reputedly the longest straight stretch of road anywhere in the world, while in comparison the railway line across the Nullarbor has a section which is 478 kilometres long without a turn. As we approached the beginning of the Great Western Woodlands, we saw evidence of the huge fire that devastated the area earlier in the year. The Great Western Woodlands is the largest remaining area of intact Mediterranean climate woodlands on Earth, with a rich tapestry of woodlands, mallee and shrublands covering almost 16 million hectares, a region larger in size than England and Wales. We stopped for fuel, a toilet break and to stretch our legs at Balladonia Roadhouse before continuing our journey. On leaving Balladonia, the road was straight but undulating for about 45 kilometres before passing through the Fraser's Ranges and the Southern Hills with its dry salt lakes before reaching Norseman. Rick and I found the journey across the Nullarbor extremely interesting. Even though it was a very long way, we had found there was so much to see and enjoy and had seen it at its best, so lush and green. What a truly amazing journey. After we had unhitched Gidget, we did a quick tour of Norseman, the last major town in Western Australia before the Nullarbor. Such a remote and important town, especially for travellers wanting to restock. The tin camels in the centre of the roundabout stand as a tribute to the camel trains that carried mail and freight in the early days, but was a reminder to us of how isolated Norseman is. We were certainly looking forward to exploring the area over the next couple of days. Returning to camp, we put our feet up, began to relax and relish the many wonderful and interesting places and fascinating history we had spent the past few days enjoying. Join us next time as we explore Norseman. Take care and stay safe. Cheers for now. Rick and Rosemary, R&R, Living Life.